Come follow me reading July 25 to 31. Esther, thou art come for such a time as this. As you read Esther, seek inspiration from the Spirit that is tailored to you and record impressions you receive. Many events in the book of Esther might seem like luck or coincidence. How else do you explain how an orphaned Jewish girl became the queen of Persia at just the right time to save her people from being slaughtered? What are the chances that Esther's cousin Mordecai would just happen to overhear a plot to assassinate the king? Were these coincidences, or were they part of a divine plan? Elder Ronald A. Rasband noted, what may appear to be a random chance is, in fact, overseen by a loving Heavenly Father. The Lord is in the small details of our lives. We may not always recognize the Lord's influence in these small details, but we learn from Esther's experience that He can guide our path and prepare us for such a time when we can be instruments in His hands to fulfill His purposes. For an overview of the Book of Esther, see Esther Book of in the Bible Dictionary. Old Testament Student Manual. Introduction. Esther's beauty was such that it could catch and hold the eye of an Oriental emperor accustomed to being surrounded by loveliness. Combined with physical charms were qualities of spirit that revealed that she had inward beauty as well. The qualities were loyalty, love, dedication. Submissive yet courageous, yielding yet faithful, she was able to avert the intent of evil individuals determined to destroy her. Indeed, she saved God's covenant people from an intended extinction. The story of Esther is sacred to the Jews and compelling to all because of her dauntless defense of her convictions and her people. Her name, in the Persian tongue, means a star. The many meanings of that symbol are most fitting. Ideas for personal scripture study. Come Follow Me Manual. Esther. The Lord can make me an instrument to bless others. Sister Anne C. Pingree taught, to become an instrument in the Lord's hands. To become an instrument in the hands of God is a great privilege and sacred responsibility. Wherever we live, whatever our circumstances, no matter our marital status or age, the Lord needs each one of us to fulfill our unique part in building His kingdom in the final dispensation. As you read the story of Esther, ponder how this statement applies to her. Look for ways the Lord made it possible for her to save the Jews. Then ponder how He has guided your life in ways that allow you to bless others. What are some circumstances or relationships that you feel He has guided you to for such a time as this? If you have a patriarchal blessing, consider reading it to learn more about the work the Lord has for you to do. Back to the scriptures. Esther chapter 1. Ahasuerus of Persia and Media makes royal feasts. Vashti disobeys the king and is deposed as queen. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the thrones of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes, his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him, when he shewed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden and of the king's palace, where were white, green, blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings, and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver, upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. And they gave them a drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house, that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abgitha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to shew the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 1, 1 through 12. Who was King Ahasuerus? The book of Esther opens with the description of a grand banquet in the opulent courts of Susa, called Shushan in verse 2, palace of the great Persian Emperor Ahasuerus. This name is a Hebrew transliteration of the king Kizyarsha, better known in history as Xerxes, the Greek form of the name. Most scholars place the events recorded in the book of Esther between about 482 BC and 478 BC. One feature of the banquet was a large amount of wine, which, according to one translation of verse 8, was to be given to the guests in any quantity they desired. That was probably the reason for Queen Vashti's refusal to appear. After 7 days of heavy drinking, the guests were probably quite inebriated, and she may have considered it beneath the dignity of the queen to parade before such a lot simply to display her beauty. Back to the scriptures. Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. And the next unto him was Kashana, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? And Memucan answered before the king and the princess, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes when it shall be reported, the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard the deed of the queen, Thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 1:19, Irrevocable Edicts. Queen Vashti's refusal to obey a direct summons of the king may engender the sympathy of modern readers, but in an age when women were expected to be subservient and when an emperor had absolute power over life and death, her stubbornness is surprising. But the reaction of the assembly is not too surprising. The men present at the banquet immediately sensed that such independence of spirit in Vashti, who was unquestionably envied by other women of the empire, would inspire a similar independence of spirit in their wives. If Vashti's rebelliousness, as viewed by these men, were to go unpunished, they knew it would inspire similar responses in their wives. Therefore they pushed Ahasuerus for action, and particularly asked for a decree that could not be altered, in verse 19. C. F. Kale and F. de Liszt explained why that edict was important. An edict issued by the king, entered among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, and sealed with the royal signet, does not pass away, i.e., remains in force, is irrevocable. The counselors pressed for the issue of such an edict, for the purpose of making it impossible to the king to take Vashti again into favor, lest they should experience her vengeance on the restoration of her influence. The king agreed, the decree was made, and Vashti lost her place as queen, setting up the opportunity for Esther to be selected as one of the king's wives and eventually to save her people. Back to the scriptures. And when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the words of Memucan. For he sent letters unto all the king's provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Chapter 2. Ahasuerus seeks a new queen. Mordecai presents Esther. Esther pleases the king and is chosen as queen. Mordecai exposes a plot against the king. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti, and when she had done, and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, Let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins into Shushan, the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hedge the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, and the son of Kish, the Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought into the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 2, 5-8. What was the relationship between Mordecai and Esther? Little is known for sure of the background of Mordecai. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and his great-grandfather was apparently carried into captivity in the first Jewish deportation into Babylon. Some Jewish writers believe that he held a high office in the Persian hierarchy that gave him access to the court. It is apparent from the biblical narrative that he was a devout Hebrew with great faith in Jehovah. He was also courageous, forthright, and practical. To his father's brother was born a daughter, who was given the name Hadassah, meaning myrtle in Hebrew. Throughout the sacred record, however, she is referred to by her Persian name, Esther, which means star. When her parents died, Mordecai adopted her and raised her in his home. Back to the scriptures. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not shewed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not shew it. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 2:10. Why had Esther not shewed her people? Esther was shown respect and deference because, in obedience to Mordecai's charge to her, she had not admitted her Jewish lineage. A Jewish maiden would not have experienced such friendly treatment. Even after her selection as queen, she continued to keep her racial identity secret at the request of Mordecai. Back to the scriptures. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did, and what should become of her. Now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given to her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all of them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Old Testament Student Manual. What were the days of purification? Adam Clarke noted that the most beautiful of all the young virgins of all the provinces of Babylon were to be selected, and these were taken out of all classes of the people indiscriminately. Consequently, there must have been many who were brought up in low life. An extended period of beautification and preparation of these women would be required to prepare them for presentation to the king. The statement that each virgin could take whatsoever she desired seemed to imply that she could choose jewelry and other adornments in order to make the most favorable impression. Esther did not use this privilege, but took only what Haggai, the king's chamberlain or keeper of the harem, gave her. She must have been of remarkable loveliness to be chosen by the king. It is also likely that the days of purification were used in training and education in the ways of the king's court, as well as in just physical purification. Back to the scriptures. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces, and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet shewed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the command of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 2:21-23. What did Mordecai do that Esther reported to the king? Evidently, Mordecai, who served in the king's court, heard of a plot to assassinate the king. Kings in ancient times were keenly aware of the risk of assassination and were well guarded, but Bigthan and Teresh kept the door, or in other words, were part of the king's personal bodyguard, and watched over his personal quarters. Their conspiracy to kill the king was especially dangerous because they had access to him. Mordecai somehow learned of this plot and reported it to the king through Esther. The account of Mordecai's loyalty was inserted here because of the central part it plays later in the narrative. Chapter 3. Back to the scriptures. Mordecai the Jew refuses to bow to Haman. Haman arranges a decree to kill all the Jews in the kingdom. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath, and he sought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had shewed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 3:1-6. Why would Mordecai not bow to Haman? There probably was nothing personal in Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman. The only explanation offered is that Mordecai claimed exemption on the ground that he was a Jew. Probably the inference is justified that Haman was demanding not mere allegiance but worship, and Mordecai would not break the first commandment. If fear of idolatry lay behind the refusal to bow down, then no Jew would bow down, and Haman's decision to take vengeance on the whole people becomes understandable. Similar acts of revenge involving wholesale slaughter are recorded by Herodotus. In Esther, however, anti-Semitism proper makes its appearance with Haman's express intention of wiping out the Jewish race. It might well seem incredible that one man's injured pride should lead to such an irrational conclusion if it were not that history has produced an equally irrational attack on the Jews in the 20th century. Back to the scriptures. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pure, that is, the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written, that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand, and gave it unto Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, The silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Then were the king's tribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province according to the writing thereof. And to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus, was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by posts into all the king's provinces, to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, to take the spoil of them for a prey. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. The posts went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. but the city Shushan was perplexed. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 3, 7 through 15. Why was the decree prematurely published? Esther was queen for 3 years before Haman put his plot to work. This he did by first casting pur, or lots, to determine the day for carrying out the decree. First for the day of the month, then for the month of the year. Here the question is forced upon us why the decree should have been so prematurely published. The scribes were summoned to prepare it on the 13th day of the first month. For this purpose, even though many copies had to be made in different languages, no very long time would be required in a well-appointed government office. As soon as the scribes had finished their work, the decree was sent out by the post into all quarters of the realm, and would arrive in even the most distant provinces in 3 weeks at furthest. This would place almost 11, and in the remotest part about 10 months between the publication and the execution of the decree. What then was the motive for such an interval? Certainly, so long a time could not be required for preparing to carry it out, nor is this hinted at in the text. Nor could it be intended that the Jews should suffer a long period of anxiety. On the contrary, the motive seems to have been to cause many Jews to leave their property and escape to other lands for the sake of preserving their lives. Thus Haman would attain his object. He would be relieved of the presence of the Jews and be able to enrich himself by the appropriation of their possessions. On the other hand, the providence of God overruling the event in the interests of the Jews is unmistakably evident both in Haman's haste to satisfy his desires for vengeance and in the falling of the lot upon so distant a day. It was only because there was so long an interval between the publication of the decree and the day appointed by lot for its execution that it was possible for the Jews to take means for averting the destruction with which they were threatened, as the further development of the history will show. Back to the scriptures. Esther chapter 4. Mordecai and the Jews mourn and fast because of the king's decree. Esther, at the peril of her life, prepares to go in unto the king. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes, and put on sackcloth and with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Then Esther called for Hatach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai, to know what it was and why it was. So Hatach went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Also he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree which was given at Shushan to destroy them, and to shew it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 4, 11 through 16. If I perish, I perish. 2 things in this verse make it of particular importance. Esther's admonition to fast for 3 days and 3 nights, and her determination to endanger her life, if need be, to save her people. She had not been called to go in to the king for 30 days, and had most likely concluded that she did not please him, and would be unwelcome if she went in unto him unbidden. Her words are an expression not of despair, but of resignation in light of what she had determined she had to do. Oriental kings usually had numerous wives, who usually appeared only when summoned, and did not take it upon themselves to see him. Going into the king's presence without permission was a capital offense. Esther's life was in jeopardy. Back to the scriptures. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Old Testament Student Manual. Esther 4:1-17. Was Esther foreordained? The Jewish people of the empire suffered deep shock when the terrible news was spread, and upon Esther there came a double burden: first the saddening news of the proclamation of death for her people, then the challenge to risk death herself to try to avert the general calamity. One of the hints of religiousness in the major characters of this story is given in Mordecai's challenging statement to Esther: "Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" It appears that an overseeing providence and purpose are implied, even though God is not explicitly mentioned here or elsewhere in this book. In other words, Mordecai told Esther that she was perhaps raised up at that time for that very purpose. It is also implied that Esther's beauty was a gift from God to put her into the position where she could gain favor of the king and save her people. Back to the scriptures. Esther chapter 5. The king receives Esther. She invites him and Haman to a banquet. Haman plans to have Mordecai hanged. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter, and said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come to this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Come follow me, Manual. Doing the right thing often requires great courage. When Mordecai and Esther stood up for their beliefs, they put their lives at stake. Our choices have consequences that might be less severe, but doing the right thing can still require courage. What do you learn from Esther 3:1-4 and chapter 4:10-17 about having courage to do the right thing? Note the different consequences Mordecai and Esther experienced after showing courage. What would a person need to know about God in order to make the choices Esther and Mordecai made, to do what's right regardless of the consequences? The next time you consider the consequences of doing what is right, you might apply Esther's courageous words in Esther 4:16 to your own situation. For instance, you might say to yourself, when I choose the right, if I lose friends, I lose friends. Back to the scriptures. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. Old Testament Student Manual. Why was Esther's timing so important? Esther seized advantage in her first favorable reception to enhance her good standing with the king and to bring about a strategic announcement of her request. But the first delay was not enough. She offered a second banquet the next night. What happened in those 24 hours was of greatest importance. The sudden desire of the king to read the records was obviously inspired from the Lord. The fasting and faithfulness of Esther and her people was productive, and brought the Lord into the situation. With Haman's powerful position and favor in the eyes of the king, a direct accusation by Esther might well have been rejected had the king not been prepared beforehand. Back to the scriptures. Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, Moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself, and tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 5:9-14. How high was the gallows? The gallows was probably not an elaborate gallows, but rather a high pole or stake from which Mordecai could be hanged. 50 cubits would be about 75 feet high. The higher the stake, the farther it could be seen. Haman's intent seems to have been to make a real example of Mordecai. Back to the scriptures. Esther chapter 6. Mordecai receives great honors. Haman mourns and is counseled by his wife. On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, What honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, There is nothing done for him. And the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servants said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Make haste, and take the apparel of the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house, mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 6. Honors for Mordecai, not Haman. It was ironic that at that particular time the king availeth himself of the services of Haman to gain from him a suggestion as to how to honor a certain deserving man. Haman didn't know it was Mordecai, for whom he was suggesting honors at the very time he had come to get permission to hang Mordecai. And thus it was that Haman had the frustration and humiliation of doing for Mordecai what Haman had hoped was to be done for himself. Moreover, he had no opportunity to do what he had planned to do to Mordecai. Note that Haman's own wife had ominously predicted dire fate would befall him if his opponent be of the seed of the Jews. Back to the scriptures. Esther chapter 7. Esther reveals Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. He is hanged on his own gallows. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen, and the king said again unto Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, and I and my people to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto the queen, Esther the queen, Who is he? Where is he? That durst presume in his heart to do so. And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king, and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the palace of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, Will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 7:7-8. Why did Haman fall on Esther's bed? In the Middle East, in ancient times, banquets were served to guests as they reclined on pillows or couches. The Hebrew word translated in verse 8 as bed may have been a couch or a place of reclining. It seems likely that Haman rushed over to Esther at the banquet and fell on her couch to plead for his life. The king's abrupt departure from the banquet may have been prompted by a desire to check Esther's story with some of the other aides in the court. When the king returned to the banquet, he interpreted Haman's position as a sexual advance and ordered his death. Thus, with no direct suggestion by Esther about what Haman's punishment should be, circumstances brought about the swift execution of the man who could have proven, even after his fall from favor, to be a powerful enemy to the queen. Back to the scriptures. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Come follow me, Manual. Pride and anger can lead to downfall. In the book of Esther, we learn from the faithfulness of Esther and Mordecai, as well from the pride and anger of Haman. As you read Esther 3:5-19-14, consider noting Haman's feelings, words, and actions. What do they reveal about him and his motivations? What consequences did he face? Reading about Haman may prompt you to evaluate what motivates your feelings and actions. Are you inspired to make any changes? How can you turn to Heavenly Father for help? See also Proverbs 16:32 and Alma 5:28. Esther chapter 8. Mordecai is honored and placed over the house of Haman. Ahasuerus issues a decree to preserve the Jews. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring, for the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is, the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants, and the deputies, and rulers of the provinces, which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing, and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by posts on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. Wherein the king granted the Jews, which were in every city, to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for prey. Upon one day in all the provinces, King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Come follow me, Manual. Fasting demonstrates my dependence on the Lord. Notice the conditions that led Esther and the rest of the Jews to fast. How is fasting a blessing to them? Why does the Lord ask us to fast? Consider what you can do to make fasting a greater blessing in your life. See also Isaiah 58:62, Matthew 4:1-4, 17:14-21. Fasting, young single adult, Ward, Amanda, video, churchofjesuschrist.org. Back to the scriptures. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that the Jews should be ready against that day, to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the post that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 8. Why were some of the Persians converted to Judaism? The task of saving the rest of the Jews after Esther and Mordecai had been saved and exalted in the realm was complicated by the announced principle that any edict which had been issued in the king's name could not be revoked. They had to devise a way to give the Jews authority to fight for their lives against those who would try to obey that first edict of death on the 13th day of Adar. Note the typical psychological phenomenon of the conversion of many people to Judaism as they saw the growing power of the Jews in the realm. Back to the scriptures, Esther chapter 9. The Jews slay their enemies, including Haman's 10 sons. The feast of Purim is instituted to commemorate their deliverance and victory. Now in the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, and the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men, and Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Poratha, and Adalia, and Aridatha, and Parmashta, and Aricei, and Aridai, and Vajistha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. But on the spoil laid they not their hand. On that day the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, The Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. Or what is thy request further? And it shall be done. Then said Esther, If it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it to be done, so to be done. And the decree went at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month of Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 70 and 5,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. And Mordecai wrote these things, and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king of Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same, yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning unto a good day. And they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and of gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do so as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman the son of Matthedah the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to consume them, and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year. And that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor their memorial of them perish from their seed. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 9:17-32. The Festival of Purim. The Pur, plural, or Purim, or lots, Haman used to determine the day of the destruction for the Jews, were now viewed by the Jews as a great blessing. The fact that the lot had fallen on a day. Old Testament Student Manual, Esther 9:17-32. The Festival of Purim. The Pur, plural, Purim, or lots, Haman used to determine the days of destruction for the Jews, were now viewed by the Jews as a great blessing. The fact that the lot had fallen on a day some distance into the future allowed Esther and Mordecai time to save the people. In celebration of this great deliverance, the Jews initiated a new festival, which is still observed among them to this day. It is called Purim for the lots cast by Haman, and is a festival of great joy. A modern Jewish writer described its celebration. Purim is the nearest thing Judaism has to a carnival. It is another full moon celebration falling on the 14th of Adar, usually in February or March. The origin of the holy day is in the book of Esther. The occasion is, of course, the famous deliverance of the Persian Jews from their Hitler-like oppressor Haman. The day before Purim is the feast of Esther, a sunrise to sundown abstention. At sundown the synagogues fill up. The marked difference between this and all other occasions of the Jewish year is the number of children on hand. Purim is children's night in the house of the Lord. It always has been, and the children sense their rights and exercise them. They carry flags and noisemakers, the traditional whirling rattles called groggers, which can make a staggering racket. After the evening prayers, the reading of the book of Esther begins, solemnly enough, with the customary blessing over a scroll and the chanting of the opening verse in a special musical mode heard only on this holiday. The children are poised, waiting. The reader chants through the first and second chapters, and comes at last to the long-awaited sentence, "After these things, the king raised to power Haman the Agagite." But nobody hears the last 2 words. The name Haman triggers off stamping, pounding, and a hurricane of groggers. The readers wait patiently. The din dies. He chants on, and soon strikes another Haman. Bedlam breaks loose again. This continues, and since Haman is now a chief figure in the story, the noisy outbursts come frequently. The children, far from getting tired or bored, warm to work. They do it with sure mob instinct, poised, silent, during explosions on each Haman. Passages pops up several times in a very face. The children's assaults. The reader's patience wears thin and finally breaks. It is impossible to read with so many interruptions. He gestures angrily at the children through the grogger storm, and shoots a glance of repeal to the rabbi. This, of course, is what the children have been waiting for. The stag is down. Thereafter, to the end, it is a merciless battle between the reader and the children. He tries to slur over the thick falling Hamans. They trip him up every time with raucous salvos. He stumbles on to the final verse, exhausted, beaten, furious, and all is disordered hilarity in the synagogue. It is perhaps not quite fair to make the reader stand in for Haman on this evening, but that is approximately what happens. Beyond this gaiety, it carries 4 religious obligations: to hear the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, read, to distribute largesse to the poor, to make a feast, and to exchange presents with neighbors and friends. This last institution of shalach manos, the sending of gifts, things that can be eaten and drunk the same day. Back to the scriptures. Esther chapter 10. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and seeking peace to all his seed. Esther 10:1-3. Why did most of the Jews stay in Babylon? Having Mordecai near the king undoubtedly relieved the Jews of much oppression and gave them a favorable place in the empire. This good treatment may have been the reason most Jews elected to remain in Babylon rather than return to Judea when the opportunity came. Points to ponder. Mordecai, in the world but not of it. Mordecai's situation is parallel in some ways to that in which modern followers of Jesus find themselves. For Mordecai, Babylon was a physical reality. He was forced to function in the midst of an alien society. Today, Babylon, or the world, is a spiritual reality. The standards of the modern world are increasingly alien to the values held by the disciples of the Savior. The challenge is to keep the values intact and yet find ways, as Mordecai did, to be of service both to society and to Christ. Mordecai could not have done what he did if he had compromised his standards. Because he had prepared himself and was willing to become involved, he eventually became the chief minister of the king. The Lord in the Doctrine and Covenants tells us to be anxiously engaged in good causes. This suggests that we can't respond to all causes. We must be selective in the things we seek to do in terms of community and civic chores, but it also suggests we ought to devote a measure of our time and talent to do these things, for they do count on the scales of action as God sees it. The world is full of fads. The world is full of the marches of lemmings to the sea. The world is full of causes that lead to conceptual cul-de-sacs. Our task, therefore, is to be wise in the selection of good causes, using the scriptures and the modern prophets as our guide. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, in her book Gift from the Sea, says, "My life cannot implement in action all the demands of all people to whom my heart responds. You will care for more things than you will be able to do things about. Wise selection of causes is one of the highest forms of the use of free agency that there is, and really one of the ways God tests our basic wisdom and our capacity to love." Have you come for such a time as this? Esther means a star in the Persian tongue. How fitting a title for a woman who may have been there when the morning stars sang together and all the sons and daughters of God shouted for joy. Though the text does not mention any foreordination or calling for Esther, Mordecai's question, "Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" suggests that Esther came into the world to save God's covenant people. F.M. Barham wrote, "We fancy God can manage his world only with great battalions, when all the time he is doing it with beautiful babies. When a wrong wants righting, or a truth wants preaching, or a continent wants discovering, God sends a baby into the world." What about you? Have you ever stopped to contemplate what your own foreordination may entail? Consider these thoughts from Elder Bruce R. McConkie. We are quite well aware that Joseph Smith and Jeremiah and the apostles and prophets, the wise, the great, and the good, were foreordained to particular ministries. But that is only a part of the doctrine of foreordination. The great and glorious thing about foreordination is that the whole house of Israel was foreordained, that millions upon millions, comparatively few compared to the total pre-existent host, but millions of people were foreordained. It may be that your calling is not to save a nation or to lead one, but one thing is certain: you are here now, not by chance, but by design. If you will, you have a role to play in building the kingdom that will eventually produce Zion and prepare for the second coming of Christ. Come follow me, Manual. Ideas for Family Scripture Study and Home Evening. Esther 1-10. After reviewing the story of Esther, your family might enjoy making simple puppets of some of the characters. They could even use them to retell the story. You could also sing a song about being brave and true, such as "Dare to do right," or "Do what is right." What words in the song remind us of Esther? Esther 2:5-7. What can we learn from Mordecai's example about helping family members in times of trial? Who in our family needs our support? Make a plan to help them. Esther 4:15-17. Esther's bravery could inspire your family to discuss how to develop courage to stand for the truth in situations they face. What did Esther mean by "if I perish, I perish"? How do her words apply to us when we need to be brave? The video Courage gives some examples. Esther 9:26-32. The Jewish Feast of Purim was established to remember the story of Esther. At mealtime this week, consider sharing stories of when your family members, including ancestors, blessed others by standing for the right as Esther did. For more ideas for teaching children, see this week's outline and come follow me for primary. Suggested song, Dare to Do Right.